Black Cat Crafts, the channel that helps you personalize your Halloween village. Today's project is part 2 of our Diorama series, Toxic Waste Cave. I'll show you how to make epoxy water that's underlit with LED lights, as well as that Kraken. I want to point out the light that you see on screen has a bit of a wave to it. That's simply a high frames per second of my video. It's not the way the light looks in real life. Your eye can't see all those changes. I really love how the depth of this project allows the Kraken to appear as if it's rising out of the deep. So you get the shadows playing on the submerged head as well as some of the submerged arms with the other arms rising out. We also make epoxy sand and put in a couple skeletons and other things. But that jaws, that's a different video. So you'll have to check out my channel to learn how to do that. Let's get into today's project. Supplies. Start off with Stone Coat Countertops Epoxy. It's the best. Can't recommend it enough. You'll need a metal pan. I got one from the dollar store. A rotating light, some mirrors, the glass for the base, painted foam to make the surround, decorative stuff like rocks, sand, dead skulls, what have you, aluminum foil, and hot glue. First step. We're going to modify this light. The light I chose is actually a night light, and it is activated by nightfall. I want it to be night all the time. After all, this is a Halloween project, so I simply took a Sharpie and colored it in. That's what that little black circle is. That's the light sensor that I colored. Once you've got that, you'll need to go to step 2. We'll build the water's base. So I took 2 pieces of glass. Again, I got these out of frames from the dollar store. And the light, I cut a hole in the metal pan and then started to build the foam base. Check out the pink foam in the middle. This both supports the glass when I put one of my Spooky Town ships on it, but also allows us to have those 2 pieces of glass, which are necessary to make that Kraken look 3D. And we'll get to that in a little bit. You'll also want to add foam, wood, or other supports around the edge of the pan because it's not strong enough for those heavy ceramic or plastic pieces. I also used those 3M sheet labels, and I made an attempt to print a water look, waves on it. It didn't really work as I'd hoped, although it did come out this beautiful semi-opaque blue look, which is great for hiding the look of the inside of the pan. Now, what you can't see here is I also have a handful of small mirrors inside the pan to help reflect the light. And I highly recommend it. While the pan is very reflective on its own, those mirrors add to the effect and make the light even more spooky. So let's go to step 3. We'll make our Kraken and do the first epoxy layer. I mentioned earlier on that it's vital to have that 2 piece of glass for the 3D Kraken look. And here's a preview of why. So part of the Kraken is actually going to be under the glass. And I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But that divide in the glass is how you get it rising out of the water. The light in the pan will reflect on the Kraken, just like you see there, and really does make this look like a solid animal coming out, not just a piece of paper. So you'll need to cut it as shown. So how do you know what pieces to cut and what not to? Well, look at the shading. The darkest pieces are the ones further underwater. So I cut those out and decided those would be under the glass. I then added a little bit of a toothpick to the back of the head. That'll give it a little rigidity and help it hang down for that 3D look when the light underneath the glass and epoxy shines on it. This is an underside view of the glass where the head is attached along with the arm. We'll use the same ideas on the parts of the paper Kraken, that are on top of the glass. The parts of the Kraken that are darkest will be almost flat to the glass, while others are just secured with a little bit of glue and rise above it. The epoxy will flow underneath, making this look even more 3D, which is obvious from this view. So there's no epoxy yet, but you can already see that it has a really cool 3D effect. And that again is just the shadow, those lights shining on the paper. So this is going to be really successful. I'm really excited about this project. The next thing to do is make your whole area that you're going to epoxy proof. I was almost going to say waterproof, but it's not water. So I used aluminum foil and a lot of hot glue to build up the beach area, and again, to make sure none of that epoxy can flow underneath. I did not have any reaction between my foam and epoxy because it's pre-painted. So that may be an important thing to remember depending on the type of foam that you're using. The foam I used is your standard pink foam. Next, you're going to build up the beach. I used crushed glass rocks as well as other rocks, some skeletons, and some greenery to start making everything look real. Time to epoxy! All right, so let's get our Stone Coat Epoxy out and mix it up. We have the two different parts. Mine are mixed in equal parts. So I put the first part already in the cups, perfectly measured, and I'm using that small measuring cup for the second part. So you have the two different parts that get mixed together, and that's where the magic happens. So what I'll do off screen is I'll do the other three, because this part of the epoxy is actually the consistency of snot or slime. But hey, this is a Halloween channel. No, I'm very carefully mixing it. I'm not using your typical, like you'd whip up an egg or anything else. Your goal with the mix is to combine the two parts without getting bubbles in. Now, of course, a small amount of bubbles, it's impossible not to, but your goal again is few bubbles as possible, because that will make your epoxy less clear. So definitely avoid really, really tiny fine bubbles. The bigger bubbles will pop on their own. In fact, you just saw a few do that right there on screen. So again, very carefully mixing, carefully scraping the sides as well and the bottom. You could use something else besides a wooden skewer. It just works for me, but if you've got a paddle or something else, use what works for you. Let's dye the epoxy. Now I'm using a transparent resin dye in 3 shades of blue. This beautiful blue, a jade blue, and then more of a teal, because I want my water to have that depth of color. As it transitions from deep water to the sand, it's going to get lighter, and also often has a little bit of a green tinge. Plus, my next video will have the toxic waste coming into the water, and that is green as well. So I'll use those 3 colors in different ways. So add the transparent resin dye to get the depth of color that you like, remembering that you are layering as you go. So as the subsequent layers go on top of each other, the colors will become richer and richer. So think about that again as you get towards the beach, where it needs to be lighter. Your resin dye should be less concentrated on that portion of the piece, but make it as you like it. That was just my strategy. So here we are, carefully mixed, again, avoiding bubbles whenever possible. Okay, so this part of the video, you can see that I've already started putting the epoxy on. I did have an issue with my earlier portion of the epoxy video. It just wasn't the quality. It was actually very out of focus. So for this version, I'm showing you really almost the end product, but it gives you the idea of how I use those 3 colors. While the epoxy is self-leveling, it's also very thick. So I'm able to use, right now, 2 colors to, again, do the gradient that I described earlier, where we have the lighter color closer to the beach and the darker, deeper blue, more where the water is deep. I am pouring a little bit of the epoxy on the beach so it'll flow where it's lower. That will prevent any lines from occurring, so be very careful to do that if you are doing exactly this, the epoxy beach. Now you're seeing that I'm sort of drizzling it on the edge, but not really mixing it together. If you want to do that, you could use a stick or any other implement to make a swirl. My colors are so transparent that you really can't see a defined line between the colors. Again, as I build the different layers of epoxy, the depth of the color really starts to look beautiful, as you can see that beautiful green along the beach's edge. The Kraken looks wet, and this is why. I actually ran epoxy right over the edge of the arms, and I did that very consistently, encouraging those drip looks to form. So the drip that you see that I just did, that's not going to actually turn into the permanent drip on the edge of the arm. What I did was I reserved a little bit of epoxy after I did a pour, and I waited until it got extremely thick, and then I very carefully added it to the arm where it dried into place like that. With so much going on, the shark, the arms of the Kraken, and the toxic waste spill, I have to be very careful to make sure that the epoxy does flow between all the different parts, so it's a nice flat look. The epoxy is self-leveling, but with so many obstacles, I want to make sure it's perfect, because any mistakes will be harder to fix in the long run. There you see I'm very carefully scraping out that cup, and I'm going for another color. So far I've only used the two colors, my two lightest ones, the lightest green and then the teal blue. Now I'm going for a little bit more of the teal blue. I'm going to use that up, and then lastly I'll grab my deepest blue color. Because there's already epoxy on the Kraken, I don't have to worry about drizzling a little bit on it. It is self-leveling. It's very thin, again, the texture of slime, and it will flow down and go around. It won't have any distinct ridges or lines in the finished product. And then again, I'm using my stick to make sure that the epoxy flows between all of that detail, between the jaws figure and the Kraken's arms. I do have another cup of that light blue off screen. I know you can kind of tell I'm almost running out. The light underneath the project, so remember we put that beautiful Aurora Borealis nightlight underneath it to give it that spooky glow, that is running. So you can see from time to time the light does change, and that's why, because it's underlit with a light that's rotating between green and red and blue and purple. Here is an additional amount of blue that I made because I was almost running out, and I wanted to make sure I had enough to get a nice thick coat. There is a portion of the water that actually goes behind the toxic waste waterfall, and that's what you saw me doing there, making sure that the epoxy got behind there. I'm also making sure off screen now that the epoxy is getting into all the corners and grabbing the final step. That's the torch. So I'm using the lighter to pop bubbles. So it's a little bit of magic that again helps smooth out the epoxy and also pops all those little tiny fine bubbles. With so many parts of my project being paper or otherwise flammable, I'm being very careful about how close the lighter gets to those. So what I just demoed was how I poured the epoxy, but let's go back to the initial step where we just added the Kraken, because I've got some really important things to point out to you that will help you be successful if you do try to copy this project. First of all, let's look at the epoxy and what those wires are all about. I used wire to help support the paper, the parts of the paper that I did not want to get in that first layer, but you can already see the effect where the epoxy flowed under the parts of the Kraken that I did not want submerged at this step. So a little bit of the head you can see is a little bit shiny. That is the epoxy on it, helping us again to get that rising out of the depths look, that 3D look that we're hoping to get. It's time now to make the arms. Get a red polymer clay and roll those out and bake according to instructions. Now we're going to add those arms using a little dot of hot glue and take the backing off of the sticker paper that you printed your Kraken on. I chose this sticker paper, the 3M paper shown earlier in the video, because it has a plastic coating to it. I thought it would hold up better to the project. I have never used a regular paper and can't speak to the color fastness, so I really liked the sticker paper as well. It has a little bit of a clear quality to normalize the colors because this clay is so dark and yet the underside of the Kraken is so light. I wanted them to start to fade together, and this worked well for me, so I'd recommend doing it again. What I wouldn't recommend is painting on your first layer of epoxy. It looks messy. I actually scraped it off on, when the camera was turned off because I hated the look so much. So later on, I do more layers of tinted epoxy. It helps add more depth. It's a more emerald blue when it's done, again, because I just hated that look. So definitely don't paint on top of the epoxy unless you're a much better artist than I am. Some of the other tips and tricks I have for this step in the process are to be very careful, very tidy about how you cut the sticker paper, and then if you get that little tiny line, to color it in. I didn't choose to use a red Sharpie. I just used a black one very, very carefully to darken the line. You can't tell that I did it, but I felt that line would be very, very obvious in the finished product. So that's another level up tip that anyone can do. You don't need any artistic talent to do that. The sticker paper is nice because it helps you get a feel for the placement, but because there's really no good way to perfectly match the shape of your clay arms to the paper, you will need to do relief cuts, little snips along the edge of the sticker paper to get it to bend nicely around your arms in a way that you find pleasing. So do as many of those as you think you might need to get it to do what you need. The sticker paper in most cases is very good, but sometimes wasn't enough. It's becoming obvious now as I make those relief cuts that some of the sticky edges I've touched too much and they're not as sticky as they were originally. And so I get my hot glue gun out and I glue them back on. It may appear that I'm melting the sticker with the side of my hot glue gun, but actually that's not the case. I'm simply using tiny amounts of glue that's on the side of the glue gun to help stick the edges down. Thought that was an important distinction to make because you really can't see it from this angle of the clip. Another thing you can't see from this angle is the detail on the arm I'm working on. It is obvious from a different viewpoint, more like the one that I'm about to work on right now. So there you see I'm making just a dot of glue for the other arm. And then next step will be to take the sticker paper, the backing off, and repeat the steps just like you saw earlier. So now we have all the arms glued into place as well as the decoration, the sticker decoration, and this looks fabulous already. Again, you can really see how the epoxy is going to add to this project to make this overall look just absolutely amazing. So let's add the more epoxy. I promised you earlier on that I would show you epoxy, and here we go. So I've got the colored epoxy in my cup. I've already added some. I am adding additional epoxy. I'm going to add a lot more than what you see in that particular cup. I am adding little bits at a time. That is because I have other cups that you can't see on screen that are slightly different colors. Some are more green, some are darker shades of blue. This will help add some of the swirls you can see shown right there. I'm also putting some on the Kraken, so you see it's starting to look shiny. My end goal is to make it look wet. So you can see that arm has a little bit of a drip on it. That's epoxy. As the epoxy starts to dry, scrape out the bottom of your container and drip it right on the Kraken. That is the magic that makes it look legit. And as you can see right there, I'm popping bubbles now, kind of using the stick to both pop bubbles, but also to gently move the epoxy around to swirl the colors very gently to make it look more like water. Now here I'm making epoxy, just clear epoxy, but I'm adding sand. So this is going to be the beach. I have never seen a better way to get sand to stay on a platform. Really, really like this method and may use it again in other projects. I did very carefully add the sand because it does run, it does settle, and I wanted to make sure that it went exactly where I wanted and kept it from where I didn't want it. Later on in the video, I'll show you what I put on the rest of the foam to make it look more like a beach. The brown color is my base color. It reflects the stone look of the rest of my platforms. Check out that snake coming out of the epoxy. Yeah, that's another craft on my channel. He's a dollar store snake. I took him and I went a little 80s and gave him fiber optic glowing eyes. Easy project, fun to do as well, and really cool for this project. So you'll see with the sand, I'm continuing to add it in very thin layers all the way around the beach. I had to come back later with another half cup of sand and touch up after this dried. The epoxy is very liquid, so using thin layers for artistic elements like this is your friend. So be very patient with it and you'll get the results you're hoping for. Continue adding layers of epoxy in your water until you're satisfied with the depth and overall look. This is your end goal. This is what we're going for. Come back next week for the toxic waste pipe with toxic waterfall. I'm really excited to share that with you. So subscribe to my channel, give this one a like, and make comments. I want to know what questions you have, what your thoughts are. Is there a particular craft you want me to try to make? I also do duplicates and I do reviews of pieces. So I want to hear from you. What is on your mind? Thanks for stopping by and come back soon.